Howdy, goody, go. Welcome to African Experts with Vickie Remoe, the show that brings you African entrepreneurs, practitioners, researchers, and innovators with big ideas and insights on issues shaping African lives. If you're just joining us for the first time, Kushe. We meet here every Sunday to ask big questions and to learn from African experts and viewers like you. If you're not yet subscribed to our YouTube channel, make sure you do so now so you never miss an episode. Quick reminder, before we dive into this week's conversation, here are a couple things to remember. This is a live discussion. Should we lose internet connectivity or electricity, please don't leave. We will be right back. Now, I want to invite you to engage with each other in the comments, ask questions, and also if you're watching, please share this conversation on your feed. According to UNESCO, sexuality education is teaching about the cognitive, emotional, social, interactive, and physical aspects of sexuality. Sex education for children is taboo in many families and communities because of the widely held belief that teaching children about sexuality encourages them to have sex. It does not. On the contrary, research has shown that those countries that implement quality sexuality education see reduced teenage pregnancy rates, reducing of the age of first intercourse, reduction in STDs, and when sex ed is done right, it also increases the use of contraceptives at first intercourse. Most times when people talk about sexuality, the focus is on reproduction alone. But for today's conversation, we're talking about comprehensive sexual education as a human right and as a matter of long-term sexual well-being. Also, we're talking about sexual education for children to reduce children's vulnerability to sexual abuse and sexual violence. Our next guest has dedicated her life to sexual education and reproductive health reform and advocacy for children and youth. But before we meet her, here is a word from our sponsor, Adama Loves Akara, which is currently available in Ghana, Sierra Leone, and online from Amazon. You're watching African Experts with Vickie Remoe. You're watching African Experts with Vickie Remoe. Welcome back. Let's meet our guest African expert, Leanne Risk. Leanne Risk is a public health educator and social justice advocate with a specialization in sexual and reproductive health. For the past 12 years, Leanne has worked in health promotion, reproductive health, group facilitation, HIV and AIDS, and community health education. She is the current country director of the Mama Pikin Foundation, a maternal and child health nonprofit in Sierra Leone. From 2018 to 2020, she was the director and community organizer at Planned Parenthood of Greater New York, spearheading community organizing efforts specific to reproductive rights and justice. Between 2015 and 2018, she was program coordinator at New York Presbyterian Presbyterian Hospital, where she supervised, recruited, and trained over 40 school based youth peer educators and designed and implemented community outreach and education programming with a focus on adolescent health, family planning, teen pregnancy prevention, and facilitating classroom evidence based education program delivery. As a teen sexuality education specialist at the Harlem Children's Zone, Inc., she led the implementation of a teen pregnancy prevention curriculum delivered to approximately 15,000 6 to 12th grade students. Between 2009 and 2011, she was the Behavior Change and Communication Officer at Mary Stopes International, Sierra Leone. There, she managed, trained, and supervised over 200 clinical and non clinical staff on implementing behavior change communication strategies. She designed and delivered trainings to over 100 community based mobilizers and traditional birth attendants who are volunteers that recruit and identify program beneficiaries. Leanne has a Bachelor of Science in Healthcare Management from Florida A&M University and a Master's of Public Health and Community Health from the CUNY School of Public Health and Health Policy. Leanne, thank you so much for being on African Experts. How are you doing today?
I'm okay. I'm okay. Hey, Vickie. Ona
How are you feeling?
kusheo.
Kusha Kapo, Adibody, Adigodigo.
Mama, small. Adena mikona.
Fantastic. So my first question to you is, what are the barriers that get in the way of children's access to comprehensive sexuality education? And I'm being intentional here to say sexuality and not sex, because I think in my mind, and I think for a lot of people, a big part of the problem is the language that we use.
Absolutely. I think language is a barrier. That you pointed that out. There are several access issues, barriers to this. First of all, it's ingrained in our way of thinking. It's a social construct to actually to segregate these kind of subjects, right? We are pulling it out of the mainstream because we want to continue to make it a taboo. We want to continue to make sure that we're in secrecy, even though we know everyone talks about it. Everyone talks about sex. Everybody is basically having sex, except for children. For the most part, we hope and pray. But we choose to never make it a direct conversation. And I think part of that is because it's a way of classing people, right? It's, like I said, it's a social construct that people are struggling with, just like so many other types of struggles, and including things like, diabetes. People keep illnesses to themselves. They keep, and then what you're doing ultimately is you're causing a barrier between people who might be able to fight this in the future, because you are keeping it as a secret. And I think that that's one of the biggest things, the taboo of it all within society that we have created as humans. And not to mention mixing in a dash of religion, a dash of culture, a dash of tribes, and the pot is just full of different things that we keep putting in to make it harder and harder for it to just be transparent. Like, yes, people have sex. Most people have sex for pleasure and not for procreation. But there are plenty of people who have it for procreation, and we wonder why they're not having pleasure or enjoyment. And we want to be able to advocate for those people. Is that wrong for me to say that? In some places it is, in some places it's not, but I say it anyway.
Okay. So what you're saying is that the key barriers to access of sexuality education for children are just preconceived notions around sex, that sex should be a secret, and cultural norms that exist already in society, and of course religion, right? People think that it's maybe morally inappropriate to teach children these topics because adults should be having sex, and people confuse providing the education with learning about sexuality, right?
Yes. I mean, as you said earlier, like the main barrier is that people think that once you open that Pandora's box or you open the floodgates of discussing sex with a child, you are then giving them the green light to go ahead and have sex, which obviously studies have shown otherwise, right? It actually works in the reverse if it's comprehensive and medically accurate and, of course, non-judgmental. But many times that's not what people get, right? So Yeah.
What happens to a child who grows up being denied access to sexuality education? And is there a gender difference in the way they're impacted by this lack of information?
To the first question, there are many impacts, that happen over a person's life from childhood to adulthood or to adolescence and then to adulthood who does not have access to comprehensive sex ed. Number one, we're seeing the effects of it. Like that's why in Sierra Leone, for example, one of the highest teenage pregnancy rates, early marriage, gender-based violence, things like FGM. And so I think that a lot of these are based off of gender too. You hear like gender-based violence or violence in general and what was I'm looking for? Interrelational violence,
Mhm.
or intimate partner violence. Those are all types of things that occur. And of course, abuse and molestation, and all these things. I think that more than anything, it's a lack of empowerment. So you're working in the reverse to raise a child who is confident, who has agency, who can understand how consent works, who can speak up and advocate for their self, and their body and their pleasure. Those are things that many, many children around the globe, particularly in Africa and particularly in Sierra Leone, do not have access to. And so all of those things, it's a domino effect. And if we really look into it, in the research lens, we would be able to see in the public health realm, we would see that it actually feeds into so many other aspects of life, including things that we wouldn't even think of, right? So, like dropout rates, obviously, of high school or younger people, the ability to have, a healthy maternal health care. Maternal mortality is not a mistake. That's also linked to this. And in general, it's a way for people to be able to advocate for themselves and their bodies. So that includes other things. Like if I'm not feeling well, I should be able to say that, and I should be able to articulate what part of my body aches or hurts, and without hesitation, and not feeling like I have to compress it and be strong or put up a front like I'm strong. But I think that those are part of it. And that to me in general is not a gender thing. It's not a gender based thing. But in society, we love to separate things out by gender. And yes, girls, women, or people with vaginas and vulvas are, statistically at a disadvantage, more of a disadvantage, but a lot of that has to do with reporting. A lot of that has to do with so many things. And I'm pretty sure that people with penises or men or male identified people or young boys can also be in the same. I don't necessarily think that it's such a huge gap is what I'm trying to say in my experience. I just feel like the silence, the culture of silence is part of it because we feed into gender roles.
Sure. If we're going to start changing the trend here on the continent, where do we start? For example, for a parent who might have grown up themselves not having access to this information, what can they do to prepare for these conversations or series of conversation? Is there a strategy? How can they make the conversations that they need to have, and most undoubtedly will have, um, less awkward between themselves and their children?
I mean, I think for me, and this is what I advise many parents, no matter where we are, but I think for me, it starts with first reflecting on your own life and thinking about the mistakes that you may have made and the things that you reflect on and say, I wish someone would have told me that. I think that it's a good place to start with just reflection, and thinking about your own story because many of us as adults, we've been through it. Like it's not something we haven't been through or wouldn't be able to tell our story about. And I think that that's really the disconnect is that parents aren't truly telling the story of them as a woman or as a man and what they had to go through until come come. You know what I'm saying? Like when until there's a situation and then you're like, saying I be said be careful, go through the same thing. Why you go, then it becomes like like a regurgitation and the child is like, what? How was I supposed to know that?
Right.
I think we're not doing the job of storytelling to help us get through it. And every parent is capable of doing that. I mean, that's a
Mhm.
starting point for me because we all have been adolescents, we all have been children, we all had crushes, we've all had relationships. Many of us have been sexually active. Um, Quite a few people have had, negative sexual experiences that they could share. Women have had periods, all these things, that we could share. And I think that I find myself here in Sierra Leone struggling, but a lot of times there's a lot of gateways, especially when we're talking about period poverty and menstruation education. That's a big thing here that it has taken, with the government getting into it and then many other people getting into it. So I think that that's one of the easier ways for women or for girl identified folks and people with vaginas and vulvas. But I think for boys, I think the easiest way for me is to really talk about consent and talk about how that looks like in the beginning. If you don't feel like doing something, you don't feel like hugging someone, or you don't feel like doing it. What's that boundary between disrespectful and I just don't feel like doing it and I shouldn't have to do it
Right.
when it comes to other people, and you as a parent establishing that. So there's like little things, I call them like teachable moments that happen throughout the day, happen throughout the time you're watching a film, the sex part comes on or they're kissing, and then you stop it or wind it or tell them to leave the room instead of letting it play and then maybe pausing and being like, so what did you just see? What was that? Have you ever seen that before? Those are the kind of conversations I have. I have two sons, and I have those conversations with my oldest son, who's 11 now. But my 2-year old, I will be having conversations with them as well. But I think that those are things to kind of get rid of that discomfort, that deep rooted discomfort that we all kind of have in the beginning. Once you open that door, you have an open door policy, and you go to those places when you have moments, teachable moments, or opportunities. I think that that makes it a whole lot better because ultimately parents are the first teachers.
Sure. That's really useful. I think the key thing that you said here is to use the naturally occurring awkward moments, right? Those moments when you're not prepared for a sex conversation, but sex and sexuality do come into your child's life. Maybe it's TV, maybe it's a song, maybe it's a music video, that instead of kind of speeding through or suppressing that parents use that as an opportunity to start conversations, because if they are open and tolerant of the conversation and their children see that they're not shying away from this topic, the children are then going to be trained to know that this is a conversation. First of all, these are things I can discuss with my parents. And I think you're spot
Exactly.
on. In my as I reflect on my own childhood growing up with my mom and my grandmother, it really was an open door thing. I mean, they didn't specifically talk about sex, but there was never any kind of feeling that I could not discuss. There was nothing that was like, oh, you can't talk about that, right? So then as I
Right.
grew older and reached different milestones, I was then able to go back and say, oh, this happened and this happened. What does this mean? What should I do? How is that, et cetera, et
Exactly.
cetera. And so when I finally got to school, being 13, 14, and we had sexuality education, it was also easier to then connect what had already been told to me at home with now the science and the research that we were being presented with. So
Yeah.
I'm glad you talked about your own child, because I think for a lot of people, the thing is knowing what is the right age to start children on their journey to sexuality literacy, and what kind of information should be provided in those early conversations. What's really key for parents to say to their children?
I think that's an excellent question and something I was just about to get into too. So I'm glad that Vickie, you be on point, girl. Anyway, so yes, the thing that I wanted to say was that in terms of age, and when we talk about like in the sex education world, right, we have stages of sexuality, and we also have this theory that was first identified and kind of coined by Dennis Daly in 1981, and it's called the Circles of Sexuality. And there are 5 circles. And what this basically displays in such an eloquent way is these 5 circles are all like all part of the human experience. So we
Mhm.
are all sexual beings, whether you're having sex, whether you are not having sex, whether you're a virgin or celibate or widowed, whether you are 1 years old or 99 years old, whether you have children or not.
Well, I'm
Yes.
mad you said widowed as like a sexuality category. What is that?
I have to reach out to all my people. Oh, hey, everybody's counted. Uh, yes, all of these folks. We are all sexual beings from the womb to the tomb. So that is from birth till death, to our dying day, until we are gone. And I think when you think of that, then you think of it as a spectrum. Because even though I said we're all sexual beings, does that mean sex? Does that mean the act or the behavior of sex? No. That means that we have desires, we have fantasies, we have the yearnings, the innate desires that we were created with, that are supposed to be there, that are a part of our sexuality, that build upon who we are sexually. And when I say sexually is connected to spiritual, it's connected to physical, it's connected to biological, all of these things. So the five circles of sexuality, let me just tell you what the five are. So there's sensuality, which is like skin hunger. This is what people describe as, how babies love to suck thumbs, love to suck breasts, love to suck in general. That's not by mistake. That's a design, right? That is part of our innate yearning for the human touch. It's
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 DNA.
something that is
It's programming, right? It's biological programming.
absolutely nobody know they teach we dandy. That is something we all just have. Okay, you cannot tell me that that is not part of sexuality, because that is built. You build upon that, right?
Right.
So sensuality is one.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Yes. The second one is intimacy. Intimacy is very difficult for people to understand. And I understand why, because it's really tapping into the emotional connection you have with people. And a lot of times we can't identify with that because we don't have models to show us what does that look like. Because many times emotions are something that people just cannot navigate well, because it's just difficult in a society that tells you emotions don't count. So I
Mhm.
think that intimacy is a huge one, particularly in the African cultures, particularly in the cultures that I am a part of, as a Black person, as an African identified person, as an African American identified person, all of those things. So intimacy, which is an emotional connection, including caring, sharing, loving, liking, all of these things, risk taking, all of those things, self-disclosure and trust. And then we have sexual identity, which is another one people struggle with. So that includes biological sex. Biological sex is how we were born. We came into the world, the doctor looked between our legs, or whoever, the midwife, and said, you're a woman, you're a girl, this is a boy. And then you go to class and you have the girls line, the boys bathroom, the girls bathroom. And then, girls wear pink, boys wear blue, all those things. And that's someone telling us that we are that, but that is part of your identity, because then you take it, receive it, and you own it many times. And then there's people who don't as well. And that also includes gender identity, which is internal. Internal. When I look in the mirror, what do I see? How do I look at myself? Am I seeing a woman? Am I feeling like a woman? Do I always feel that like that? Do I always feel that way? So that's something that, on the
You know,
continent we struggle with,
you know,
definitely.
I told, we struggle with it now, but we haven't always struggled with it. I think
Yes.
in some of the stuff I've read is that within indigenous African cultures, gender was always on some kind of paradigm. It was never a male
Yes.
female. There were always extreme femininity and then extreme
Yes.
masculinity, and then people who are male feminine, people who are female but masculine, and everything in
Yep.
between. And some cultures, they even had different names to call
Mm-hmm.
those individuals. But with colonialism and religion and the patriarchy
And
and
white
everything,
supremacy.
girl, let's not even start, because on this show I have dropped white supremacy multiple times, so I'm trying to
Well, now me
no,
they drop her down. Now me they drop her. Now me turn. Eh.
because and so we've we've imbibed it and forgotten our indigenous cultures and our indigenous values around sexuality, even around intimacy, right? So that
Hmm.
we've now we're playing in a space where like now we have to be taught these things that
Exactly.
our ancestors knew innately, because we're so disconnected from the indigenous. We're so disconnected from who we are, from our identity, right? So now
Hmm.
we only know, and you have people who would swear down because of religious indoctrination that, you know, na mane uma no more day. You understand? Because of that indoctrination. And what they actually, and
Absolutely.
then they say that these other identities, so like LGBTQI, that those are imported, when in actuality, no, the actual problem is your religious indoctrination. That's what has
Exactly.
been imported. The other things have
Hmm.
already always existed in our community. You know, I just wanted to make a point to say that. But yes, please
Yeah.
take us down the various the circle of sexuality.
Yes. So we were on the sexual identity part. Then I said the gender identity again with this, which is internal, and no one can tell you what your gender identity is. Only you. Only you. So that's the reason why it's a process. It takes time. And there are people who are in phases and are not clear or not sure, because a lot of this is a long period of conditioning, a long period of indoctrination from the time you were born and even before you were born. And then that also includes sexual orientation, which is who you choose to love, who you are attracted to. So, and people a lot of times they tend to gray all these lines and think that they're the same, and they're not. So this is why sex education is important.
Yeah, but
And
what
then
you
the
said
next,
is so clear, because you've given us three things. There's sex, whether you have the female sexual organ or the male sexual organ. Then there's gender identity, whether how you feel inside, as in, do I feel more masculine or feminine? And now you're talking
yes,
about sexuality or sexual preference, which is who do I choose based on what I feel like inside, and my
exactly.
sexual organ, who do I want to mate with? This is so clear. How is this complicated? How is this a
Mama,
complication? Oh,
it is
no,
complicated. Oh, and then
no, yeah, it's culture. Like I said, it's culture that makes people they refuse to understand, right? It blocks the depth. But continue.
yes, and I also want to say with the biological sex, it's not just female genitalia or male genitalia. There's also the intersex individuals that do exist throughout our society. There's many
Yeah,
who walk among us, who might be related to us, that might be our friends. And
yeah.
it's their genitalia might be a little on the ambiguous side. And so those people exist, and not a witch. You know what I'm saying? Those people have been in existence as long as everyone else has been in existence. So
That's,
again, yeah. So those are all real things. And then the next
I feel
circle
like
is
this is that conversation that many people are probably embarrassed to even tune in live, but they're gonna watch it later, so nobody sees them watching.
no problem. I didn't tell nobody. Everybody, anyway, people who know me and follow me, they know what I do. So it is what it is. The next circle is sexual and reproductive health. Sexual health and reproduction. So therein lies your agency with your healthcare, sexual behavior. That's the behavior part. So the sex, whether you're having anal sex, oral sex, or vaginal sex, or any other things that you're doing with other people. And then, of course, your anatomy and physiology, which is a huge one for me. I think that to me, that's a staple. And anytime I am with people that I'm going to educate, whether they're adults or whoever, I'm talking about anatomy, because many people do not understand the functions.
And by
The
anatomy, what
functions,
it means is the different parts of your sexual organs and what they do, right? So
yeah,
that,
exactly.
you have penis, you have testicles, you have other male parts, and then you have
Scrotums, right.
all of that. We're not going to say all of them because, again, this is Ramadan. I know that there are people who are just like, why are you even having this conversation? But we must, because even within, even it is very important that we have these conversations, because the more informed our people are, the better off they'll be. So please, yes,
Exactly.
bring it on. We're here for it.
Okay, so anatomy, like I said, and physiology, and then we have contraception and abortion, which is also under this sexual health circle, sexually transmitted infections, and reproductive systems. You know, as I said before. So those are also, it's a huge part of the learning curve over your lifespan. There's many people who, and they don't start to know these things until adulthood. Like, it is ridiculous that you would go through a biology, curriculum and go through all of that stuff and never ever have a conversation about your own. And I think that is such a disservice. And then the next circle is sexualization. Now, this is huge. Okay. So when I think of sexualization, I think of objectification. I think of exploitation. I think of things that happen here quite often in the continent due to poverty, a lot of times is what we say, but it's due to a lot more too. It's due to culture. It's due to a lot of things that we just try to sweep under the rug. But also under this category is like things like flirting and being flirtatious and media messaging and images,
Which is
pornography.
all of it is like sexualization, right? The things that tell you how to be sexual, right?
Exactly.
The codes and the nuances that you get from society and externally to say, this is how we want you to behave for your gender. This is how we want you to behave to mate. This is how you should
Exactly.
act. And along with sexualization, one of the things that makes me extremely uncomfortable in Sierra Leone specifically is the early sexualization of girls that,
Oh
you
my
know,
goodness.
while children are still so young and so vulnerable and fragile, that even the language that we speak about babies, two
Hmm.
people have babies, their babies are the same age, they meet, they don't say, oh, if their children are of different sex, they don't say, oh, our children are going to be such great friends when they grow up, or they'll
No,
play together, say, oh, mi pikin go marry you pikin. Like automatically,
exactly.
the only way that we can relate male children and female children, oftentimes even in our language, is to sexualize them. Adults sexualizing children
Hmm. Hmm.
constantly, constant.
Yes.
I mean, I even get people who message me on Facebook and leave comments sometimes that I think are very inappropriate when like women, when they're referring to Olu, they'll say like, "Oh, Olu is my man," and it makes me very, very uncomfortable because I'm like, this is incredibly problematic. Because, or
Yes.
they'll say, "Oh, Olu, they can't get girlfriend," and I'm like, he's 5 years old. I promise you that is not what's going on in my head, and it's certainly
Or
not
his.
what's going on in his head. And we have to check ourselves, right? These are things we have to unlearn because they add to the conditioning and sexualization that we put on children that shouldn't be there, and we start making them
Yeah.
ripe for exploitation, right? Because if you teach a
Right.
young child all these kind of sexual ways to behave and flirtations and the way they go waka, all of these things that they
The
learn, right?
dancing, the dancing, the dancing.
Yes, they'll call them very quickly to come and like, oh, can dance, as like some kind of skill they're displaying, and it's all
Yeah.
very, very sexualized. So no, you're totally hitting the ball. But I'm really glad we're having this conversation because I hope that parents who are watching and they're listening are, even if you don't agree with everything, at least just having this conversation now is helping you to process certain things or ask yourself certain questions or be aware of certain behaviors that you have that may not be helpful at all for your child's sexuality well-being. We're going to go to a quick commercial break, and then we'll be right back with more from Leanne. You're watching African Experts with Vickie Remoe. watching African Experts with Vickie Remoe. Welcome back to the show. If you're just joining us, you're watching African Experts. And this is a good time to subscribe to our YouTube channel or to turn on notifications on Facebook so that you never miss a broadcast. With me on the show today is Leanne Risk, who is a public health and sexuality education expert, and we're talking about sexuality education for children. Leanne, what are some of the mistakes that parents make when they're having these conversations or trying to engage their children in conversations around sexuality?
Before I say that, I just want to say, y'all better get Adama loves Akara. Did you hear? Did you see? Yes, yes. I'm like, every time I see this advert, I'm like, oh my God, Vickie. And I don't even get, look me, I'm over here advertising for you. Yes. Go ahead.
It's very funny that guests come on the show and they're like, that's right, Adama loves Akara. And of course, I love to get Adama loves Akara.
Yes.
Anyway,
yes,
what are some of the mistakes that parents are making right now with regards to their child's sexuality literacy? And again, I'm using intentional words like sexuality literacy because I think reframing and breaking down this the taboo a lot of times is giving people new words and new ways to express it, because if we just say sex education, ultimately for African people, what that says is, oh, you want to teach my child how to have sex. But when you say sexuality literacy, they're like, oh, that might be something else, because they know like regular literacy. So they're like, okay, sexuality, like, okay, I see where you're going. So I'm really trying to help us go on this journey, because we need to go on this journey. But what are some of the mistakes that parents make?
Yeah, and also just to that point, Vickie, is that also, I mean, I agree with what you're saying, and I'm all down for creating buy-in where we need to. But I do feel like we also need to take back these words. Like, we need to take back these words and break it down, because a lot of these words are still in society. And you know some of the words that we use in Creole, referring to women's parts and things like that, and a women's anatomy, and even men's anatomy in general, and body parts and genitalia, which seem to have a huge negative connotation. And so how do we empower people to take those terms back? Not always just renaming and and things like that, but I think it's important for us to take it back.
Release them, right? Some things we don't even need to take back. There's certain things that
sometimes
we don't like, and it's, language sometimes is very hard for people to let go of language, because they feel like the language is a part of their identity, right? Like, if I can't use this word to express this thing, that means this thing can't be, which is, of course, is a fallacy, right? You can rename. Tomorrow we could start calling this phone Polo, right? If all of us agree this is Polo and it's no longer phone, it can be Polo. So for some of the language that we use that is really destructive to our children's education and sexual literacy, if we need to get rid of them, let's get rid of them, right? And if we need to change, for example, also on the verse, like you said, one of the key things is talking about our children, talking about sexuality, and being able to talk about our children's parts, right? So naming things for what they actually are. So for me, with my son,
that is one of the mistakes. That is one of the mistakes.
Girl, go ahead. I don't know how they're making this mistake.
So one of the mistakes is rooted in shame. Like, one of the hugest mistakes that parents do is to shame children, shame themselves, or shame the act when they are speaking of or speaking about. And I'm being very particular about saying speaking of, because many times we're not speaking directly to the children. The children are just hearing us talk, about said subject, about a gay couple you saw in the supermarket, about the sex scene, or about your boyfriend or a girlfriend on the phone, or your husband or wife on the phone. And I think those are things that a lot of times, and then the shame that comes with the subject of sexuality, the subjects related to sexuality, is one of the hugest and biggest disservices that we do for our children. Because when you do that, you create such a barrier that goes so deep, and it's really, really hard to reverse it. It's not impossible, but it's hard. It's difficult to reverse it. And one example that I love to give, in accordance with the example we just were talking about with anatomy and us not naming things by their name or calling things by their name. So I used to work in a school in Harlem, New York, where we were talking with kindergarten mothers and fathers, and there was one case where a young kindergartner, female, her mother referred to her vagina or private area as cookie, as her cookie. So she did not know it by any other name. And then lo and behold, there was a staff member who was on the team at the school who was molesting her. And she would come to her teacher and tell her for like a 2-week period that, someone was touching her cookie, and was taking her cookie. She would say, take her cookie. Someone took my cookie. And the teacher did not know how to respond. And a lot of people wanted to blame the teacher. Do I think the teacher should have been a little more proactive? Sure. But I also know that there was 28 children in the class, and teaching is not easy. Teaching is not easy. And but to me, the biggest burden was on the mother. The fact that you were telling your child that the name of her parts, of her vagina, her vulva is a cookie, was a huge disservice. It turned out to be a huge disservice at the end because she could not communicate effectively what was happening to her. Although we ended up finding out, but after 2 weeks of her being molested by a janitor, and I'm sure there's so many stories very similar to that. But how many parents can actually say that they call their children's body parts by the proper names? You say it's a vagina, a vulva, a clitoris. Do you say those things to your child? Do you say that? Do you tell them that these are things that should not be touched? Right. The penis, that this is your penis, this is your, that this is your testes or testicles. Do you say that to your child? Do you tell them that it's not supposed to be touched by anyone? And if it is, you should be able to say, someone touched my vagina. Just like that. Just like that.
Yeah, no, I think it's such social conditioning. I mean, so with my own son, of course, because I knew this, coming from a place like Sierra Leone where sexual abuse is such a big thing. I was sexually abused as a child. And my parents never spoke to me about abuse in general. Like, a woman sexually abused me when I was a child. And so just having had that experience, I knew that there was no way I was going to have a child and not talk to them about consent and not talk to them about their bodies, calling things for what they are, so that a child can. So between my son and I, it's definitely his penis. And, I explained to him, that boys and men have penises and girls and women have vaginas. Yes. Have there been moments where he would just blurt out things? something vagina.
Yes. So I commend you. 2 thumbs up, Vickie, for doing that, because
there's silly things like you just say the crazy thing, something vagina. I'm like, Olu, no, please. But I rather have that understanding. It's terrible. I'd rather that he have that understanding and have the language tools, so that as he grows up, that's something, because I see it as something that you build on and you start the foundation when they're young. Right now, I'm not talking to my 5-year-old about puberty because he's not reached that age yet, right? I'm not talking, I am, however, talking to him about body integrity, right? So the conversation that we've had is, who is allowed to touch you and when, right? So if I'm giving you a bath, it's okay for me to touch you and wash you, right? If somebody's washing you, somebody in our family washing, right? He understands that, right? So those kinds of where you create in my mind, I'm like, it's to create like a zone of safety where you see like, these are the people, and this is what is considered, this is acceptable, but anything else,
Right.
anything else,
It's off
and even
limits.
just like, even in
Yeah.
my own paranoia, which maybe might be so terrible because we have a live-in nanny, you know, sometimes, you know, he might be hanging out in the nanny's room. I'll just go in the room. Not because I suspect anything at all, but just because in my mind as a parent,
Yeah.
you have to be in a state of awareness. You just have to kind of like be actively aware that abuse can happen. And it usually happens where people trust
Yeah.
in that way. So, which takes me to my next question, which is, in what ways can sexuality education reduce or prevent abuse in children? And you know, and how do you do that? How can you educate your children where the intention is, okay, I want to give them information to make them, of course, abuse is going to happen regardless, right? But how can I make it so that when they're being groomed, maybe in the process, because they have this information, they can come to me and give them the information so that abuse and sexual violence and all of that, we're empowering them to be to have agency, right? Should they find themselves in these situations?
Yes, I'm definitely, I think we already kind of started talking about that with the anatomy and making sure that you're talking to your child. Also, utilizing these teachable moments, these opportunities that happen every single day, where to have the talk, there is no such thing as the talk. These are talks and discussions that
Talks. We have
happen
to talk.
continually. Absolutely. And it's to build upon each other. So as you said, Vickie, like right now, you're not having conversations with Olu about puberty. But if Olu came to you and said, "What is puberty, mommy? I heard this word." You should be able to explain to him what puberty is, even though it's not his turn yet. And explain to him that it's not your turn yet, but when it is your turn, mommy will be there, and we'll get through it. I think that those are the things, because you have a very inquisitive little boy, and you have brought him up to ask questions and feel great to ask questions. What is happening in our culture is that, and what has happened is that many children are not empowered and encouraged to ask questions. They look at it as PTI and or disrespect for kids to ask questions, when really that is what we need. We need kids to ask us questions so we can be the navigators we're supposed to be, and navigate them in the right direction. If you're asking me this question, there has to be a reason. Where did you go hear this? You go this talk, yeah, so,
but
and
I
get
think
into it.
the unfortunate thing in our communities is that we have a negative view that if you're asking it, it's because you've heard it and you've done it and you're guilty. Do you understand what I mean? So it's that.
Yes.
So then when you hear something and you want to ask and you want to have the conversation, you do not ask because you know that the adult or the parent or the guardian, for the most part, that you will go to is going to immediately accuse you, right? Like, the reason why you're asking me, where do babies come from? Oh, now because you don't begin my business. Oh, okay, you don't begin get girlfriend. And that makes you want to know.
Exactly.
Like,
and that's part of the shame. But that's part of the shame aspect. So now you're shaming the child. And when you start doing that, you completely are pushing that child away. And then you will never be the person they come to. And this is what happens a lot of time in our society. We shut it down. We don't believe the child. So these are all my recommendations. To have and create a safe space where your child feels like they can come to you and speak to you. Use those teachable moments or opportunities throughout the time, your day, that are just not just like calm, sidom la, talk to you about sex. You don't want to do that. You want to just make it a part of a natural conversation. When we see something.
Okay. Are you home after school? Let us talk about sex. Like, no.
Yeah. So it's all about preparation. It's the same thing. How many stories have you heard of women and girls who had their first period and thought they were about to die because no one ever told them? And now the mom wants to say, "Oh, yes, that's happened to me. In fact, I do it now." "Oh, well, all along you couldn't tell me, lady? You want me to just go around thinking I'm about to die?" This is the kind of stuff. So even though Olu hasn't, and that's just an example, but Olu hasn't talked about puberty, if he did come, it's an opportunity to let him know, yeah, it will happen. And when it happens, I'm here. You know what I'm
I will have
saying?
I will have to find that Google resource or that YouTube video that I will watch first, because
There's so
sometimes
many.
the challenges as
You could just
parents we
text
don't
me. You could text me.
we that too, like sometimes we also don't know the answer, right? Like you don't know
Yeah,
the answer, like if you know it because you're an adult, right? But you don't know the answer in a way that you can make it make sense to your child for their age. And I think that a lot of times
yeah.
that's the struggle. How do I explain this thing? So like when Olu asked me, where do babies come from? And I had to explain.
Where do
It
babies come from?
hurt
Yes.
my head explaining that. It actually hurts my head to, like you find yourself navigating the tropes, right? Like, okay, well, when two people, you always want to start from the responsible, idealized place. When two people love each other.
Yes. But one thing I want to encourage parents is to not overthink it. Try to stay simple. Try to stay simple. Like not try to get into the books and the terminology. Just try to stay simple. Just say, sex is an adult act. It's an act that, two grown-ups do. And it's a way that they show that they like each other, love each other. And it's also a way to bring babies in the world just like you, because mommy had to have sex to have you. You know what I mean? And if you have any further questions about sex, you can come to me. We can figure it out together. And I mean, I think that to me is like, and it makes it so normalized because you're almost like, let's move this conversation along. That they're like, oh, it's like, okay, it's not that big of a deal. And I think that that's really where it starts. It just starts by keeping it simple, keeping it short, not like, not it, overthink it, and because they'll see it that you're overthinking it. I think it's important to just keep it as simple as you can and keep on building upon it, and then you can prepare afterwards, especially once these conversations happen. But I think that those are the main things, like not to shame, not to and make sure that you're not trying to shame. Try to stay objective and very cool and collective. Be open. No blaming, like you should. Don't use shoulds and woulds and coulds. Just be like, listen, I want to know. And then when they come to you, after they come to you, so tell me where you heard that from. I just want to know. And they can tell you, because once they have opened up and you have told them what you told them, they'll be like, oh, I heard this boy on the bus or at school talk about it, or I heard it in a song. And then those are the things, and you can start to put it together and like, okay, so they're really listening to the lyrics of this song, like they're really really getting it. Yeah, so I think that those are all parts of it, and making sure that we are keep continuing to do our own education, educate ourselves, use the resources of the internet. There are some recommended sites and things like that people can definitely ask me if you follow me on social media. But there are so many things out there that can help you have these conversations in a healthy way, that do not encourage sex. And there are plenty of resources, statistics that show that when you have open, honest, medically accurate conversations about sex, which is comprehensive sex ed, your child is less likely to initiate sex. Their sexual debut is delayed. And that is a choice that they tend to make on their own, because that's a source of agency. Because I know these things exist. I know that STIs and STDs exist. I'm not trying to do that. I know that there's the possibility of children can come out of this situation. I'm not ready
I
to do
was,
that.
I was, I was, I was that person. Like I took health class in ninth grade, and when they talked about syphilis and this and this, and I'm like, whoop, Vickie is not having sex until she is out of high school because I can't do. Like it was like, okay, my life decision is made here. We need not. No,
Yes.
thank. And I don't think I had intercourse until I was in college, because maybe I shouldn't have said that on the show. I've never had intercourse. Actually, I take that back. Never ever
Yes.
had intercourse at all.
And and even if they do choose to have intercourse, they know what to do, and or where to go, because comprehensive sex ed will never leave you out there resourceless. Right? It will always connect you to the services, connect you to the protective and preventative things that you need to know for yourself. And I think that all of those things are better than leaving someone out there to figure it out on their own. What could be worse than leaving them out there to figure it out? Exactly. So that's my two cents.
One of my final questions to you is about we know that schools, and of course, your past experience speaks to it, schools are the most important place for children to really learn anything, especially sexuality. What do those making education policy on the continent for African children need to know about sexuality education that they may be missing? How can they bring it into schools? Like, how do we get the ball rolling? Because sometimes there's a lot of pullback from the community. So educated, but what do
Yeah.
policymakers need to know about sexuality education in curriculum?
Yeah, I think that what African policymakers need to understand is that many of us are looking for ways to have resources and funding to decrease the amount of negative impacts that we already have and negative things that are already in the limelight. Like for example, Sierra Leone, we have one of the highest teenage pregnancy rates. All of these things, and they are correlated. Understanding the science.
Sierra Leone has the 19th highest teenage pregnancy rates in the world. So of all the countries, we are 19. One out of every three girls is between the age of 15 and 19 is already pregnant. Another like 30% are either like already child brides. Like in terms of like the
Yeah.
outcome for girls in Sierra Leone, it is
Right.
really bad. I mean, for many, many years, what the NGO said that Sierra Leone was the one of the worst places, if not the worst place, to be a girl because the
Yes.
outcomes were so negative. And I do believe like a huge part of that is that girls don't have the information, they don't have the
No.
protection, they don't have the information to protect themselves. Their mothers also don't have the information because it's like a vicious cycle, right? Your mother didn't have the information, she made the same mistakes, you also don't have the information,
Exactly.
you make mistakes, and for so many harmful things in our communities, we're left to our own devices. Leanne, any last words before we close out today's program?
Yes. So thank you so much for having me on. I also just want to encourage people to understand that, sexuality and sex is not a bad thing. We need to embrace this as people who truly want to see Sierra Leone and their countries, their African nations improve, and you want the future of your child to go beyond where you are. And if you are having those aspirations and dreams for your children, sex ed, comprehensive sex ed, is one of the most vital things that you could advocate for. And if you understand that, then we can be, I mean, the limits, the sky is the limit. There is no limit to what we can do and accomplish. And I also wanted to just share with you, Vickie, that I was prepared now. I was prepared to go all the way because I brought my vulva puppet. Because we were talking about anatomy, and I'm starting to make these here
I
in Sierra
think
Leone so
all
that we
you're
could have.
trying to do is to get invited back on the show. So what we're gonna have to do is to have you back on the show, perhaps in a conversation around just like feminine health, women's reproductive health, and women's
Yeah,
reproductive rights. So we can have a more in-depth
wonderful.
conversation because definitely, I think that the more women know, the more parents know, the more girls know, the more all of us society know, and the more we have these conversations, the less problematic and the easier it becomes also for other people to have these conversations, right? For a mother to be less
Absolutely.
ashamed to start the conversation with a child in their own
Yeah.
home. With that, we've come to the end of today's African Experts. I would like to thank my production team at vrcmarketing.com, Salwa Kamara, Frank Vin, Bob McKewin, Mohamed Gando Jallo, Abdulhamid Kanu, Alassane Kargbo, and Augustine Carbo. And thank you to our guest, Leanne Risk, and all of you across the continent in the diaspora for tuning in. For more information about this and other shows, please visit africanexperts.net. Today's quote comes from Proverbs 22:6 from the King James Bible. And it says, train up a child in the way he should go. When he is old, he will not depart from it. And I think about sexual literacy and sexuality education in the same way. If we give our children the tools they need right now and the information they need right now, they're going to grow up into young adults and adults who are sexually empowered and have the tools they need to protect themselves, and also to just have sexuality well-being, because sexuality and sexual health is all part of everyone's well-being. Until next
Yes.
week, una tenki and tata from all of us here on African Experts. See you next Sunday.